Morning, everybody. Happy Is She Still Here Day. And welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's assistant editor, Jason Beattie. Good morning, Jason.
Morning, Susie. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Despite the job title, Jason has been on the politics beat for a very long time, so he knows his onions. Very useful to have around on days like today. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to invent a mechanism to remove us instead. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the news that 3 Tory MPs have finally broken cover to put their names on calls for Liz Truss to quit. Crispin Blunt, Andrew Bridgen and Jake Wallace, none of them renowned, it must be said, for being calm and considered, say it is blindingly obvious she has to go, about 3 weeks after everyone else in the country realised the same. Now, this morning, the markets have reopened and had their first chance to react, both to her press conference last Friday and her appointment of Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor. And so far, it's looking good, touch wood. Well, it's better anyway. The gilts are surging, the cost of borrowing is going down a bit. But Jason, this is ahead of an expected announcement we've got at 2:30 this afternoon, where Hunt is widely expected to pretty much undeliver all of Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, isn't he? This is the city reacting to what they hope is going to be some common sense.
The fact he's got to do this shows quite how dire the situation is. So he must have looked at the numbers. He knows that the Office for Budget Responsibility is talking about not a 60 billion hole in the nation's finances, but a 72 billion hole. And he's done the sums and he's had to act. And take whatever analogy you want, Susie. You can see it as somebody in a balloon, which is about to hit the ground, chucking everything overboard. So almost every single policy that Kwasi Kwarteng announced in his mini budget, that's been chucked over now. But maybe, but kind of, the cut to income tax may stay, but that's about it. Everything else is being jettisoned. The big question is whether, the next thing to be chucked overboard is Liz Truss. There's not much point of her hanging around now that, everything she announced has been kind of thrown overboard. The other way of looking at it, you could see it like, maybe, it's like the bailiffs have come knocking at the door. They've already handed over the appliances, the furniture, and just, all Jeremy Hunt's got left is the wedding rings. So, they've gone and they're sitting in this very empty room. Staring
I saw an analogy online a minute ago that said it was like taking the scissors off a toddler and locking them in a cupboard after they've already severed their arteries.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a good kind of metaphor for that Truss is not necessarily in a cupboard, but possibly in a cellar in Downing Street. But they're not going to let her out anywhere they can. And the last thing they want to do is to let her speak, because that could spook the market still further. She's definitely being held hostage for as long as she remains in power. But the point we really should be making, because this is this having to do all this comes at a huge price, and that price is actually going to be paid by us. It's going to be really painful. We're back to austerity, and we're back to austerity because Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss blew up the economy, and that's going to mean, less money for public services, which are already creaking anyway. If your school building is crumbling, that's not going to get repaired now. I can't see how they kind of, get the NHS backlog back down because there's no money. I can't see how they're going to stop the problems in the courts where people are waiting years for cases to be heard. There's no money for that. Well, it goes on. And at the same time, your mortgages are going to get more expensive and your rent's going to get more expensive. It's grim. Really grim. And that's the outlook for the next year at least.
Yeah. And last time, of course, they blamed Labour. They blamed Gordon Brown. They said, we need austerity because there's no money left.
Mm.
And that's that. But this time, it's literally we did this. It's
Yeah,
us.
I mean, they can't blame the EU. They can't blame Putin. They can't blame Labour. This is on them. It's entirely their fault.
It's kind of
I mean,
astonishing as
it was
well. Sorry, go on.
fairly bleak economic picture anyway, and they've made it 3 or 4 times worse than it could have been. I mean, and this is the problem. This is why it's implausible for Truss to stay in office, because everything which happens from now on is going to have her name attached to it. If your mortgages go up, that's Truss's fault. If there's no money to invest in your local area, that's Truss's fault. If you can't get a pay rise, that's Truss's fault. I mean, this is the problem. She's kind of shackled to this in a way which, unless they get rid of her, they it's going to contaminate everything they try and do for the next 2 years.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of well, I'm old enough, to remember when we used to get one budget a year. I think we've had about 3 in the last 6 weeks. So
I'm old enough. We used to get one chancellor a month.
Yeah. we've had 4. I can't remember on now in 4 months.
I'm 4.
It's astonishing. But we now got today. This is, seeing as the last thing that Kwasi Kwarteng did wasn't a budget, it was a fiscal event. And he was going to have another announcement on October the 31st about how he would pay for it, which is a bit like saying, can I have my exam results, please? I'll sit the exam later. This is now today a mini midterm fiscal plan, not budget statement. And we may still have another announcement on October 31st anyway. And it's saying there in the paper that they've turned the economy into what was something where the equivalent of Germany or America is now the equivalent of something like Greece or Italy. So tanked it pretty much. Now, keep asking us your questions, everybody. What do you think about what Jeremy Hunt may say today? He's been called the de facto prime minister because he's jettisoned, as Jason said, every single thing that Liz Truss said she was going to do and wanted to do. And he's gone in and said, no, we're not doing any of that. Now, Mike says, when Jeremy Hunt is the adult in the cabinet room, the country is in a dire position. He always reminds me of a duck, Jason, just a surprised looking duck. And he is now Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, people are saying he's a safe pair of hands because he's been in government posts for a long time. But Truss was in government for 10 years. And where did that get us?
Yeah, he does have the demeanour of somebody who's kind of lost their comfort blanket, doesn't he?
Yeah.
It was always something. I mean, he's very calm. He went boo really loudly. He'd be a bit scared. And that's the problem.
Yes, he is a bit. We're breaking up a little bit. You're going a bit like the TARDIS, but I think we'll probably try and skim through, see where we can get. It's your shed out the back there. It's got terrible Wi-Fi, mate.
It's been very good up till now.
Keep asking your questions. Now, on Wednesday, we've got Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons, when Liz may well be hoping that a rally in the pound means that she can tell Starmer she's fixed it. Everything's fine now. But he's still going to rip her apart for having had to throw every single one of her ideas out and saying, if I was Keir Starmer, I'd say, well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know why Liz Truss, the MP for South Norfolk, wherever it is here, because the Prime Minister is obviously the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is sat next to her. He should be answering the questions. But as I said, on Friday, we've got this poll of polls, which is being released, which is the overall opinion of Truss for the past week, as far as voters are concerned. If Labour is still ahead, and I think the lead is more than 30 points at the moment, she could well be in serious trouble, couldn't she, Jason? Even if the pound rallies on Friday, if the opinion polls are still an electoral wipeout.
I mean, I don't even think the polls matter anymore. The problem is she's so damaged that the prospect of her going into the Tories going to a general election under her leadership is just implausible. I mean, can you imagine? What she offer? I mean, she can't offer economic credibility. That's gone. She's got such terrible communication skills that she can't actually she has no rapport with the public, so she can't actually just be like the kind of the maitre d, who is kind of like running the kind of the restaurant while all the others do the hard work, because that doesn't seem to kind of that's not going to wash with the public. She's got no long-term strategy, so I mean, every Tory MP will be running a mile. They want to put her on any leaflet anywhere because they just know that she's disliked. So, well, not disliked. It's more just she's just so useless. So, I mean, they need to get rid of her, and they know that. It's just a question of how, and that's the victory of us stumbling over.
Yeah. Now, Strip Bear, possibly not his or her real name, says, would she be the shortest prime minister in history if she went this year? I don't know how tall she is, Strip. Disraeli was pretty tiny. I think Margaret Thatcher is probably the shortest in recent history. But if you mean the shortest serving prime minister, then that would be George Canning in 1827, who only served 119 days in office. But that is because he died. So, she might be one of the shortest serving who didn't actually, get taken away by God, as it were. So she's certainly, whenever she goes, there's going to be a lot of comparison, Strip, and she's probably in the running, isn't she?
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
September to now is what? We're only a month, 6 weeks so far. So she's well ahead. She's off to a racing start as far as beating George Canning.
Well, I mean, that's one achievement she can actually notch up. Yeah.
Exactly.
The question is, of how they engineer her departure. And there's a number of stumbling blocks they have. The first is they've got to find somebody the whole party can kind of coalesce around. And that's kind of proving difficult. They don't want Rishi's kind of still distrusted because he knifed Boris Johnson, though he's actually got quite a good bedside manner. There's Penny Mordaunt, but she's actually quite inexperienced in many respects. There's talk of Ben Wallace, but again, we only know he can do defence. There's doubts about what are his views on health, what are his views on the economy. They're a bit of a mystery. But he's seen as a safe pair of hands. So we're looking at him, and then of course there's Hunt as the kind of the caretaker who just steps up.
The duck prime minister. Whose name everybody gets wrong.
Leslie's got a very good point by saying it's not just Truss who's damaged, it's the whole Conservative Party, isn't it? I mean, yes, that's the thing, is that she's not just destroyed her own career, she's destroying the Tory brand in a way which could be irrecoverable for several years. And that's the delight for Labour. I mean, when they took out Boris Johnson, or Boris Johnson took himself out, however you wish to look at it, but that was seen much more of a kind of a personal kind of association. His personality was such that it didn't necessarily feel like the whole Conservatives were contaminated about it. It was much more about his own kind of personal failings and lack of probity and lack of honesty. With Truss, it feels much like the whole project has been contaminated, which would exactly what Labour wanted. So it's like
Well, these are the things that the fringe of the Tory party have been yelling about for years, that we've heard about for years, about tax cuts and corporation tax and growing the pie and the trickle-down economics, and years and years and years. And the minute they do get the chance to do that in an unfettered way, whole thing's tanked. So it actually would require some rethinking of where the Conservative Party is, whether they're more centrist, whether they're more liberal, whether they're just a bit more bubble up rather than trickle down. It involves quite a lot of reassessment, I think, and maybe a decade in the wilderness would do them some good. Now,
and of course, the risk is, Susie, that this is where they start to split, because the tensions there are deep and widespread, because they still haven't resolved whether they are this kind of libertarian party who is kind of still kneeling at the altar of a Thatcherite creed, or whether they are this kind of one nation kind of centrist party, and that's the debate is partly ongoing now as they decide or try to decide who could take over from Truss, but it's going to consume them once they're out of power. I mean, the only thing holding them together at all is power, and when that goes, then you can see it unraveling quite badly. Shame.
Marvellous. That's what I like to hear on a Monday morning. Thank you, Jason. I'm sure that's made everybody salivate a little bit. Now, keep getting us the questions, ask us your comments. Now, in the comments, there is a link to a live stream being run right now by the Daily Star. And it is live streaming Liz Truss versus a lettuce, trying to work out which one is going to last longer. do go and click on it. Keep it up all day, because you may well find that she's looking a little more weathered and brown around the edges as things wear on. But it's quite worth doing. Well done, the Daily Star. Now, in the sidebar on page 4 in this story, it's reported that if the Tories, well, if there was a general election held tomorrow, 10 cabinet ministers would lose their seats. The names are amazing. And my word, I would stay up all night to watch these tumble. We've got people who would go, include Jeremy Hunt, Therese Coffey, the Deputy Prime Minister, Tory Chairman Jake Berry, and Jacob Rees-Mogg. Mogg would be toast. There's a mega poll here, and it shows that the Tories would lose 219 MPs, including the Secretary of the Treasury, Simon Clarke, the Levelling Up Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who's Transport, Chloe Smith at Work and Pensions, Robert Buckland at Wales, and even the COP26 President Alok Sharma. But Boris Johnson in Uxbridge would lose by a landslide. That would be probably the easiest win ever. Now, this is the kind of thing, Jason. They would still perhaps have 138 MPs, which is humiliating and it's awful. It's less than the 202 Jeremy Corbyn was left with in 2019, which was the Labour's worst election defeat since 1935. It'd be worse than that, but it's still enough to rebuild. 138 MPs is still, they've still got some safe seats. And those 138, if they acted now to get rid of Truss, would save their seats. Whereas if you wait a bit longer for this bin fire to get worse, they would lose it. And there's another
example of how kind of cataclysmic this is. I just looked up Anne-Marie Trevelyan's majority in Berwick on Tweed. It's over 14,000. I mean, that's huge. I mean, Alex Sharma is about 4,000. That's understandable. I mean, he would expect to go, but that for anything 14,000, we're talking huge numbers, and kind of the comparisons here are like what happened to the Conservatives in Canada when we went down to 6 MPs, or going back to the UK to kind of like 1931, when Labour was completely annihilated, and the National Party led by kind of Ramsay MacDonald, which was bulk of which was Conservatives, had 502 MPs. I mean, this is extraordinary times, and it just shows how feeble politics is at the moment, but also how the traditional party binds they no longer exist. Things could move really quickly, and the mood can kind of shift like a kind of tidal wave, not like a little rivulet.
Yeah, I think the wind has changed direction. That moment came a couple of months ago. I think Johnson was sort of tacking into it for quite a while, and he was going to lose anyway, I think, as Prime Minister, but not as badly as this. This is trouncing.
But this is, I think, what Truss did was she burst the dam of discontent. So this was building up. I mean, if you look about, we had the kind of the years of austerity under Cameron and Osborne, then we had the kind of the kind of shambolic kind of 3 years of Theresa May and the Brexit infighting, and then we had the kind of the awful kind of Johnson interlude where he kind of trashed our institutions and trashed kind of respectability and politics. And you look back and you think, well, what have the Conservatives achieved apart from inflicting Brexit on us, which has proved incredibly divisive and economically damaging? So, this kind of discontent was building and building and building. It was kind of a cap was put on it, partly because Jeremy Corbyn was unelectable. But once you have a plausible Labour leader, and you have the self-destruction of trust, you can see why the dam has burst.
Yeah, for 12 years there's been no Northern Powerhouse, there's been no HS2, there's been no bridges to here, there, or anywhere. There's been no new hospitals really to speak of. Schools haven't improved. Potholes have got worse. Austerity, inequality, everything's just got worse for 12 years. I can't think of anything that's got better. And if I could find one in the spirit of being an objective journalist, I'd tell you it, everybody, but sorry, it's a blank. John says, we should have a vote of no confidence so the Tories are made to back her. Last question before we move on to the next story then, Jason. 138 MPs who know their seats are safe today, but perhaps not safe tomorrow, is enough to bring down and collapse the government. If Keir Starmer were to table a vote of no confidence in the government, those 138 have to either abstain or say, no, this is fine. Is that a way forward? Is that a mechanism?
I think Labour would love to try and engineer that vote if they can, but they're quite difficult under the kind of Commons rules, because the government actually basically has control of what happens in the Commons to organise. And that would be, you know, this is where the Tories would start getting kind of rather trying to move behind the scenes first, because they know that they don't want to be put in that embarrassing situation where Labour can go into election saying you back Liz Truss in a vote. So, I mean, my money is that the rules at the moment is that Truss shouldn't have to face a leadership challenge for 12 months. These rules are made by the 1922 committee of Tory MPs. They can be ripped up as quickly as they are made. It's more likely we'll get a delegation of Tory grandees who will go to Truss and say, look, leave with dignity or leave with no dignity. You know, that's your choice.
But that's even worse, isn't it? Because then you just get someone imposed on us again. You're even further from the mandate they had in 2019. And the general public, anybody, Tory voters as well, they all want a general election.
Yep. That's the problem. It's how you do a transition without ceding the right for a general election. And the more messy that transition is, the more the clamour for the country to go to the polls will be. So it's difficult, and you know, it's being conducted by a party which is how can we put this politely, is quite chaotic at the moment.
Not firing on all cylinders, let's say. At least they are, but in opposite directions at all times. We'll have to see. If I was Keir, I'd be trying to engineer that vote, because I think that's the only way. And if they are going to impose someone on us, I think they've got to impose someone who immediately calls a general election, because it's the only way that the country actually recovers. Yes, they'd lose to Labour, but at least they'd get some dignity on the way out. Be the ballot box that did for them rather than themselves. Now, keep asking us your questions. We're going to dive in now to the next story. And I've got a story in the paper this morning. Hooray! Woo-hoo. Page 20, page 19 wouldn't exist without me. Well, it would actually. Page 21 wouldn't exist without me. And it's about the nuclear test veterans that I've been reporting on for the past 20 years. There's a much longer version of this story online. The full 12-inch long player version took a bit of a crunch in the paper. But now, in her race to number 10, Liz Truss said all sorts of things like cutting taxes and backing a medal for the test veterans, and insists she has to do them now she's in, except for the medal for the test vets. Since getting inside number 10, she seems to have blocked the release or the announcement of that medal decision. Now, the background, Jason, is we know the medal committees, there are two of them, we know they have met. We know a recommendation was made from one up to the other one, and we think it's been signed off, but there's no plan for that to be announced. These guys, I think perhaps there's no plan because it's going to be perhaps bad news, and they want to limit the amount of bad news they've got. I'm sure if it was good news, Liz would be chucking it out. But these guys have already been waiting 70 years since the first bomb test, 40 years since the Mirror started campaigning, 4 years since we started banging on about a medal, and 102 days since Boris Johnson said they ought to have one. And they're dying on average at the rate of about one every week or so, because they're in their 80s now and they're not terribly well. Now, I don't really want a medal from Liz now. I suspect it wouldn't last the wash. Hopefully we'll do better with the next Prime Minister. But this, Jason, this is Johnny Mercer, the former Veterans Minister, which she fired. It's accused her of playing cruel political games with these elderly veterans. And this is part of her problem in a way, isn't it? When she said stuff to all sorts of people to gain power, she then rewarded the most loyal MPs with government jobs. But there's only about 100 of them. And she ejected everybody else. And there's 200 disloyal MPs on the backbenches like Mercer, who've got experience, who feel betrayed. And it's people like him that are going to do for her in the end, isn't it? They're the ones who would vote against her.
The way she formed her first government was incredibly cack-handed. She didn't seem to take into account that in the first round of voting for the Tory leadership election, which was amongst Tory MPs, she only got 50. Now, that should have been a warning sign, but hang on, my support within the party isn't as strong as I would like. So then it went to the membership. She won the membership, not quite as overwhelming as people were expecting.
56%, wasn't it? Not massive.
Yeah, so 81,000 Tories voted for her. Gosh, I'd love to find them and see what they think now. And then, a kind of a more astute politician would actually have looked at the situation and gone, well, I need to be as inclusive as possible, because I don't have the backing across the party. instead, she went out of her way to antagonise those who hadn't backed her, particularly anyone who supported Sunak. And lo and behold, they're now taking their revenge.
Yeah, you actually made your tent smaller, then it's easier to attack, isn't it?
But all good kind of prime ministers kind of balance their cabinet. So you look at Tony Blair when he came in. He had Claire Short in his cabinet as international development secretary. She was very much on the left of the party. She was a kind of Blairite critic, but he decided it was better she was in the room than standing outside it, hurling abuse, and it made sense. Even Thatcher included the Wets who in her cabinet, because she realised that there was a place for people like Heseltine and Ken Clarke, even though they weren't ideological soulmates. So I mean, but Truss kind of did the exact opposite, but from a much weaker position. So it's not surprising that you've got people like Johnny Mercer here now kind of willing to go on the record to say that this was such an error. I mean, the other thing we should point out, Susie, I mean, well done to you for keep going on this campaign. You're getting so close. If only we had stability in government.
People keep resigning, Jason. We've seen off, I think, 3 prime ministers so far with this campaign. It's killing me.
I know, and we're so close, and it was really kind of moving at conference. Susie introduced me to some of the families of these veterans, and it was very moving to meet them and to see, and but how much it means to them. So hopefully,
and it shows
maybe Prime Minister Hunt will be able to finally kind of
Prime Minister Duckface. The thing
keep
is
saying that's easier. It helped.
The thing is as well, I think it shows just how thin-skinned Liz Truss is. So, we know that she was like only rewarding loyalty, like you said, and she was, expending all her ability to buy loyalty with a government job on people who were already loyal, which is futile. You leave them on the back benches to do your bidding and get the other people in. But she seems to be, what we think is happening behind the scenes here is that she is so worried about the possibility of bad headlines, or someone in her team is, if it's not her personally. They're so anxious not to have bad headlines, not to deal with the Mirror, not to think anybody could possibly, from the Mirror, might want to give them a good headline, which I do, that they're somehow giving themselves worse headlines by delaying something and now getting accused by her own backbenchers of playing cruel political games with nuclear test veteran heroes. And Liz, if you're watching, it's going to get worse. You either go or you do the right thing. And that applies to this as to everything else. There you go.
I hate to break this to you, Susie. I don't think Liz is watching. I think she's hiding behind a sofa.
I was in Downing Street on Friday night to do a paper review, inexplicably in an empty road, in the rain. But it was so weird to be outside someone's house complaining about them while they're just up there, possibly watching you. It was freaky and peculiar. I hate that job. Right, we need to move on to a little bit of good news now, but keep asking us your questions. We'll have a roundup at the end. What do you think Liz Truss should do for the nuclear test veterans? Should she give them a medal, or should she just get out of the way and let Keir Starmer do it? What do you think about Jeremy Hunt's a bid to run the country unofficially? Should he become Prime Minister? Should there be a better one? What is the mechanism that you think we should find to remove Liz Truss from all our lives? Unfortunately, we can't just hit delete. But first off, there is some good news in the world, and here it is. Now, the COVID pandemic did lots of terrible things to many of us. It made us all watch that video of Matt Hancock smooching his not wife, which some of us are never going to forget. But one of the best was the vaccine rollout. And that meant huge amounts of government money speeding up the development of vaccines that don't involve injecting you with a weakened version of the virus, but actually programming your immune system with a little bit of DNA from the virus so you don't have the impact, and you can actually just reprogram your immune system constantly, uploading data to it. Brilliant. So that method of giving us the DNA of a disease means that the makers of BioNTech vaccine here say that has also sped up cures to find a host of other problems, including cancer, that they reckon they may be able to fix by the end of 2030. It's not very far away, Jason, although it does sound like it should be a James Joyce novel. It's not far away. do you think this would be good news enough that all those idiotic vaccine refuseniks would finally admit that science does have its uses?
I mean, if it's possible, it's just extraordinary, because this is the kind of one of the holy grails of medicine. And the other thing I'll point out about this is that the two scientists behind BioNTech, Ugar Sahin and his partner Özlem Türeci. I mean, Özlem is the daughter of Turkish immigrants. He is a Turkish immigrant, both based in Germany, and you kind of wonder, this kind of all these people who kind of worry about kind of Britain's borders and kind of keeping people out. Well, actually, if you invite people in, they can actually make your country, in fact, and other countries, so much better.
You're keeping the potential out, aren't you, as well?
Yeah. And Germany is, must be incredibly grateful to have these two extraordinary people working for them. Yeah, maybe we should actually learn lessons from that.
Especially as they will be taking some effort to protect their intellectual property rights, and there'll be loads and loads and loads. If they do get a cure for cancer, loads of money coming Germany's way. Someone offer them a visa. That's all I'll say. Now, do we have any questions to wrap on before we finish off for the day? And lots of general elections. We've got lots of comments apparently calling for a general election. Like I said, people want it. Tory voters want it. Labour voters want it, especially Labour voters. But it's going to probably redraw the electoral map of Great Britain. And if you think you are in a safe seat now, you may need to think again, because as Maureen says, there are general elections needed now. Something, as Jason said earlier on, if you've got a 14,000 majority, it could well go. It is worth next time definitely voting for the one you like the best, as opposed to thinking tactically, because the tactics are going to go out the window if they're overturning 14,000 majorities. Elaine wants a general election as soon as possible as well. If you are not registered to vote, go and register to vote. Make sure you're registered to vote. Keir Starmer has moved his policy and press team into a campaign headquarters and thinks the government could collapse at any minute. It could happen, and then you'll only have 6 weeks before the vote. I think we might get one before Christmas. I'm hoping. That's what I've asked Santa for, Jason.
There is an argument that actually it's in Labour's interest not to have a general election now, but have one in because the economy is such a bad state. But all they do is have to come in and just actually they can't do anything they want to do because they have no money. Let the Tories, have a year of taking all the pain, hope things pick up. And, just like Blair came in after Black Wednesday, and actually, the economy was in a slightly better pace when they got there, and they were able to do more. It's just an argument. Personally, it's fine by me, apart from
we'll all be eating babies by then. That's the trouble. So it may be an idea to do it a little bit earlier. And Kieran would have a terrible time for the first year, but everyone would kind of expect it, and he wouldn't get any of the blame for it. It would just
be true. They can blame everything on the Tories for the next 10 years. It's fine. It's all Truss's fault. Told you.
You got 3 terms now, a Labour 3 terms, and then by the end of it, of course, they'll be as corrupt and mad as this lot, and we'll having these discussions about them. Something to look forward to, isn't it? Now, thank you very much for taking part, everybody. Thank you, Jason, for joining us.
Thanks,
if you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. And by the way, please go and look again at that Lettuce live stream on the Daily Star's Facebook pages, because it's worth viewing. It'll happen one day. Does the lettuce outlast Liz Truss, or does Liz Truss
What's your money on, Susie?
My money's on the lettuce, because that's sprayed with chemicals. It's just is. Sorry. It's probably not terribly organic. If they've had any sense at the Daily Star, they've bought the most chemical lettuce.
It's got more personality.
Covered it in hairspray. Yeah. You could get the lettuce to bet on the markets and see what happens, and see if it makes more money over the week than this trust. Has it lost 72 billion? No. Okay. Lettuce for Prime Minister. There you go. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking part, and we'll see you all again on Wednesday for another game of Is She Still Here and an edition of the News Agenda. Tatty bye. Oh, what was that?